Sometimes the person who saves your life doesn't come wearing a uniform or arrive in a siren-flashing vehicle, but walks into your world quietly dressed in worn boots and sun-bleached denim, saying little and asking for nothing. And if you judge them based on appearances alone, you'd miss everything underneath. And that's exactly what almost happened to Ellie, a stubborn, fiercely independent ranch owner who had been raised on open skies, dirt roads, and the quiet wisdom of a mother who taught her that trust was earned, not given. So when her truck broke down 25 miles from anywhere, and a stranger appeared out of the heat haze, walking with the kind of slow confidence that comes from someone who has nothing to prove, she was more suspicious than grateful. And yet something about him was different. Not just the way he spoke, but the way he observed her truck. The tools he carried, the silence he wore like a second skin. And though she offered to pay him for his help, he simply said, "I'm not here," for the money, and fixed her engine with the kind of precision that suggested a life far more complicated than that of a simple drifter. And this wasn't a romantic comedy where sparks fly instantly and flirty banter fills the air. No, this was real raw and a little uncomfortable because Ellie had been alone for a long time by choice, not necessity, and letting someone linger in her space even temporarily was not something she did often. But when she invited him back to the ranch for a meal out of courtesy, not charity, she couldn't have predicted that she was inviting into her world a man who had once disappeared from his own by choice and was now searching not for redemption, but for a reason to stop running. And over the following days, Robert, as he introduced himself, integrated into the rhythm of the ranch in a way that felt almost eerie, not just capable, but instinctive, as if he had grown up working cattle, fixing fences and reading the land the way some people read books. And though he spoke little, Ellie noticed everything about him, the way he never flinched at hard labor, the way he always positioned himself between her and any perceived danger, and the way he watched the horizon as if waiting for something or someone that might never return. And people often forget how healing silence can be in a world that praises loudness. And performance, sometimes what we need most is someone who listens without trying to fix. And Robert did just that. He became a quiet presence in Ellie's chaotic world, steady and unshakable. And though he never offered details about his past, Ellie felt something in her own chest begin to soften. Because when someone consistently shows up without asking for anything in return, it's almost impossible not to start believing that maybe, just maybe, they're there for the right reasons. And yet beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Because Ellie's land, which had belonged to her family for generations, was being targeted by a predatory developer named Ray Easton, who masked his greed in business suits and legal documents, but was nothing more than a vulture circling what he thought was vulnerable prey. And Ray wasn't just offering to buy her land, he was threatening her legacy, everything her parents had built, everything she had protected since their passing. And while she had dealt with men like him, before, she had never faced this level of pressure, intimidation, and sabotage. Fences were being cut, cattle were spooked, and her supply deliveries were being mysteriously delayed. And while she filed reports, the sheriff's office was slow to act, and suspicion grew heavier than rain clouds in a drought, until one night when the threats became more than paperwork, when two masked men entered her barn with torches ready to burn her out. And Robert, who had taken to sleeping in the bunkhouse, heard something before anyone else, grabbed a shotgun and dealt with the intruders swiftly, not violently, but decisively, disarming and restraining them until the authorities arrived. And that moment changed everything, because it revealed a side of him that was anything but ordinary. The way he moved, the way he calculated risk, the way he anticipated tactics, all of it screamed training, discipline, experience. And Ellie, who had served a short stint in the reserves before taking over the ranch, recognized the marks of someone who had once operated at the highest levels of tactical planning. And that night, as they sat on the porch watching the sheriff's cruiser disappear down the gravel drive, she looked at him differently, not with fear, but with curiosity, and slowly questions began to form. Who was he really? Why did he know how to handle himself like that? And why did he choose to wander dusty roads instead of living a life that clearly once involved power and precision? And while Robert didn't offer explanations, he also didn't lie. And Ellie appreciated that, because trust doesn't require full disclosure. it requires consistency. Robert had that in spades, and the irony of it all was that while Ellie had initially assumed she was the one in control, the one protecting her land and her world from outside threats, she was now slowly realizing that the man she had thought was passing through was anchoring her in ways she hadn't known she needed. And this is where the story begins to reflect something universal. Because in life, we often overlook people based on surface level assumptions. We dismiss the quiet ones, the ones who don't boast or brandish their resumes, but it's often those very individuals who carry the deepest strength, the ones who have nothing to prove because they've already faced the worst and survived. And this isn't just fiction. There are countless real-world stories of highly skilled individuals who walk away from fame, fortune, or position to live lives of simplicity after experiencing profound loss or trauma. Take, for instance, Adam Kay, who after serving 2 tours as a Navy SEAL left the military, started a nonprofit and lived out of a truck for 2 years helping veterans transition back into civilian life. Or consider the story of Sarah B., a corporate lawyer who after losing her husband in a climbing accident gave up her career, moved to a small Montana town, and now teaches survival courses to teenage girls. These aren't characters, they're real people who chose to disappear in order to reappear somewhere that made sense for their healing. And Robert, whatever his real story was, seemed cut from the same cloth. And Ellie, who had spent so much of her life fighting alone, now found herself wondering what it might mean to build something, not just for survival, but for joy and connection, and maybe even love. And that is where we will continue next. As the days turned into weeks, something inside Ellie began to shift, not all at once, and not with the kind of sweeping drama that movies like to depict, but in the subtle accumulation of ordinary moments made sacred by consistency, the way Robert always woke before sunrise to tend the livestock, without being asked, the way he remembered how she took her coffee, strong and black, the way he never tried to impress her, only to be present. And though he still hadn't revealed much about his past, she could feel in her bones that whatever he was running from wasn't criminal, but emotional. And if you've ever spent time with someone who carries invisible grief, you recognize it not in what they say, but in what they avoid, the way their eyes glaze over when certain topics arise, the way their body goes still when someone else's pain brushes too close to their own. And that's how Robert moved through the world, as though he were still carrying pieces of a life he no longer had access to. And Ellie, despite all her resolve and independence, found herself wanting to understand him, not because she was curious, but because she had begun to care. And yet, every time she reached for more, he pulled away, not cruelly, but protectively. And she wondered what it must feel like to be both a fortress and the prisoner inside. And while their rhythm at the ranch grew more natural, a storm was brewing just over the horizon because Ray Easton hadn't given up, and his threats were becoming more aggressive. Contracts rewritten with hidden clauses, lawyers showing up unannounced with offers that barely masked coercion, and one day a man posing as a county official came to inspect her land, citing fictitious environmental violations. And that was the day Ellie snapped, not out of panic, but with a clarity forged in fire. She threw the man off her property and went straight to the county clerk, where she confirmed what she feared: someone was trying to seize her land using fake fines and strategic delays. And when she told Robert, he didn't react the way she expected. He didn't pace or curse. He simply asked for a copy of every document, every contract, every letter, and disappeared into the study for hours. When he emerged, he held a binder marked with tabs, color-coded and cross-referenced, and what he said next changed everything. He said, "Your ex is using shell corporations to hide the acquisitions, and most of them trace back to a holding company in Nevada, which is tied to a developer known for hostile takeovers of agricultural properties. And the only reason I know this is because I've seen it before. I used to be on the board of one of those companies." And in that moment, the air between them grew so heavy Ellie could barely breathe, because it was the first time Robert had referenced a former life. And though the name he used was still Robert, his voice sounded different, fuller, more precise. When she looked at the binder, she saw something else: monogrammed initials on the spine, RDH, and suddenly all the fragmented clues fell into place. The way he moved, the tactical precision, the quiet grief, the knowledge of corporate structures. She realized with bone-deep certainty that he was not just some man with a complicated past. He was Robert D. Harrison, the billionaire heir to Harrison Equities, who had vanished from the public eye after the tragic death of his fiancée in a plane crash nearly a decade ago. And Ellie didn't say anything at first because the flood of realization was too loud in her ears. But later that night, she sat alone on the porch and felt a different kind of heartbreak. Not because she had been lied to, but because she hadn't been trusted, and trust for someone like Ellie wasn't given lightly. It was forged through sweat and silence and labor. And to find out that the man she had started to imagine a future with had chosen to hide the truth from her felt like betrayal. When Robert came to speak, she didn't yell. She just said, "I would have stood beside you if you had asked, but you never gave me the chance." And then she left quietly, not off the ranch entirely, but back to the guest cabin, her childhood sanctuary, needing space to figure out what parts of this were real and which were projections, and Robert didn't chase her. He returned to the barn, resumed the chores, and kept his distance. Not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that healing meant letting someone else decide when they were ready. And while Ellie wrestled with the dual truths of who he was and who he had become, she also realized something else: the man who had saved her ranch, who had comforted her in silence, who had taught her to soften again, wasn't some fantasy billionaire. He was the same man she had cooked dinner for, the same man who had mucked stalls without complaint, and that realization began to soothe the betrayal, not erase it, but place it in context. And this entire dynamic mirrors something very real in trauma recovery and relational therapy, where one of the greatest threats to intimacy is not abuse or abandonment, but concealment. Because when someone withholds major truths, it triggers the very wounds they think they are protecting others from, especially for those who have been hurt before. Transparency is not just a courtesy, it's a form of care. And as Ellie learned more about Robert's past through the documents he left on the porch, she began to see not a man who wanted to deceive, but a man who no longer knew how to be seen without fear of being used or mourned or pitied. And that is a kind of grief that often goes unnamed, the grief of being known only through tragedy. And so after a few days, Ellie returned, not with answers, but with an invitation. She said, "I don't need to know everything today. I just need to know who you're choosing to be." And Robert, who had once walked away from empires, boardrooms, and global headlines, simply nodded and said, "Choosing to be here." And that choice changed everything, not overnight, but with the slow certainty of rain after drought. This kind of revelation isn't just compelling in fiction. It echoes real stories like that of Marcus W., a tech mogul who left Silicon Valley after his wife's death and now runs a nonprofit teaching mechanical skills to teens in underserved communities. Or the story of Alicia M., who inherited millions after a family scandal and used her fortune to secretly pay off the medical debt of hundreds of strangers over 3 years. These aren't stories of fame or redemption arcs. They're stories of people choosing new identities, not to escape but to rebuild. And Robert's path mirrored theirs, not in wealth but in intention. Because when someone who has everything walks away from it all, the question becomes not what did they lose, but what were they hoping to find. And Robert had found something in Ellie, in the ranch, in the quiet labor of rebuilding fences that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with substance. And as they began to rebuild not just the ranch, but the trust between them, the true heart of the story began to emerge: that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stop hiding and let themselves be known. And in doing so, they don't just become whole again. They invite others to do the same. And that is where we'll continue next. The weeks that followed weren't quiet but purposeful, as Ellie and Robert no longer operated in the shadows of confusion or unspoken pain, but as partners building towards something greater than survival. They began gathering evidence, not just to protect the ranch, but to expose the web of corruption Ray Easton had woven throughout the valley. And what started as a personal battle soon revealed itself as a pattern repeated across neighboring lands, where older ranchers had been coerced into selling through legal manipulation, harassment, and even threats. And the more they dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Ellie's property. It was about every small landowner who had been steamrolled by faceless corporations, hiding behind shell companies and lawyers. And for the first time in years, the community that had once operated in isolation began to stir with quiet rebellion. Neighbors who had barely spoken since their wives passed or children moved away began showing up with paperwork, coffee boxes of receipts ready to testify, and the Carter Ranch became more than a battleground. It became a headquarters, a place where the forgotten found their voice again. And all of this happened under Robert's steady guidance. Not as a leader barking orders, but as a strategist, quietly organizing evidence, coordinating affidavits, tracking financial connections across states. And while his last name remained unspoken among the group, the people around him began to realize that this wasn't just some wanderer helping out. This was someone who knew how to fight powerful men. Because he had once been one of them. And yet through it all, Ellie never let herself forget what mattered most. That this wasn't about revenge or empire. It was about dignity. The right to protect what her parents had built, the right for people like her to say no without being crushed, and that clarity gave her a strength she hadn't felt in years. And Robert, watching her speak with passion to a room full of farmers and ranchers, saw in her the same fire that had once drawn him to leadership, but this time it was anchored in authenticity, not ambition. And if you've ever been around someone who speaks from soul, not ego, you know it changes the room. People lean in, they trust, not because they're told to, but because they feel it. And Ellie's words had that power, not polished or perfect, but real. And Robert felt something stir in him that had long gone dormant, a desire not just to protect, but to belong. And that shift was mirrored in how they moved around each other, less guarded, more intimate in the small ways, shared glances, meals made without asking, hands brushing as they passed tools. And one evening, after a long day of organizing depositions, they sat on the porch. Robert reached for her hand and simply said, "I never stopped loving after she died. I just stopped believing I'd ever feel this way again." And Ellie, who had never been one for grand gestures or emotional speeches, simply leaned her head on his shoulder and replied, "Then maybe this time it's about believing together." And that quiet promise between them said more than any vow. And yet, even as the community rallied and lawsuits were filed, Ray Easton didn't back down. In fact, he escalated, hiring security firms to intimidate key witnesses, spreading misinformation about Ellie in local press, and even staging fake protests to make the ranch look like it was operating illegally. And the pressure mounted. The threats became more specific, and one night a fire broke out in the North Pasture, controlled quickly, but clearly intentional. And that's when Ellie and Robert knew it was time to go public. Not just with affidavits, but with names. They contacted an investigative journalist from the state paper who had long been tracking rural land seizures, and within days a full report hit the front page detailing how Ray Easton's network had acquired over 40% of the county's private ranches using deceptive tactics and offshore banking connections. While some in the community were still afraid, most now stood taller, emboldened by truth, and in a town hall flooded with new energy, Robert finally stepped forward and introduced himself, not just as Robert, but as Robert D. Harrison, and the silence that followed was absolute, because everyone had heard the name. Many thought him dead or exiled, and here he was, not behind glass or cameras, but in boots and work gloves, sleeves rolled up, telling them that he had chosen this life because he believed in people who didn't give up, even when they had every reason to. And Ellie stood beside him the entire time, not as his defense, but as his equal. And that image would later become the lead photo of the article that sealed Ray's fate, because public pressure, political inquiry, and shareholder panic forced him into legal scrutiny. And within weeks, arrests began and lawsuits froze his assets. And for the first time in years, Ellie felt the weight begin to lift, not just from her shoulders, but from the land itself. And the day the county clerk handed her a certified document verifying her full legal protection over her property, she cried, not from relief, but from release. And Robert stood nearby, silent, hands in his pockets, eyes soft, knowing that this victory wasn't about power, it was about peace. What followed wasn't a fairy tale, but a choice. The choice to stay, to build, to grow together. And that brings us to the emotional core of this part of the story, which mirrors so many real-life movements where local voices band together to resist exploitation from those with wealth and power. Whether it's farmers in India resisting land acquisition or residents of Appalachian communities fighting environmental degradation. The pattern is the same people underestimated for their simplicity rising through solidarity and winning. Not with might, but with truth and purpose. And what we see in Robert and Ellie is that very arc of resilience, where love isn't separate from justice, but part of it, where romance grows in the soil of mutual respect and shared values. And by the time the legal dust had settled, the ranch had not only survived, but become something more, a living symbol of what happens when two wounded people choose not just to heal, but to help others heal too. And that's where we'll continue next. With the legal battles behind them and the valley safe from further exploitation, life on the ranch settled into a rhythm not of silence, but of steady harmony, a kind of calm that doesn't come from the absence of conflict, but from the knowledge that what matters has been protected. And for Ellie, it felt like waking up from a long storm, one where for years she had been bracing against the next gust of wind, only now to find that the sun was still capable of warming her skin, and Robert was still there, not just physically but emotionally present, showing up each day, not with grand gestures, but with small acts that built a home without needing walls. And it was in those quiet mornings, feeding horses or planting saplings, or sitting together on the porch as the dogs snored beside them, that they began to imagine something new. Not a return to what was lost, but a future defined by what they chose to build. And Ellie, who had once believed that love was something distant, something she might admire from afar but never hold, began to realize that love in its truest form didn't demand perfection. It asked only for participation, to be fully present, even when it's hard, even when the past still lingers in the corners of your mind. And Robert, who had spent years hiding from the world, who had built walls so high no one could climb them, let Ellie in, not because he stopped grieving his fiancée, but because he finally understood that grief and love can coexist, and that loving again is not betrayal, it's continuation. And with the community now thriving, the ranch evolving, and their bond deepening, Robert decided it was time not for a spectacle, but a promise. So one evening, as the sun dipped low and golden light poured across the valley, he led Ellie to the east field, where a circle of wildflowers had bloomed unexpectedly, and where a small table stood with two chairs and a handwritten letter resting on a wooden box. He motioned for her to sit and began to read, not a rehearsed speech, but words from the heart about the moment he first saw her, not at the broken truck, but at the kitchen sink after a long day, how her hair was pulled back, how she hummed under her breath, how in that moment he felt something shift. Not because she saved him, but because she reminded him that he still wanted to be saved. And when he finished, he opened the box, and inside was a ring, elegant, simple, and engraved, not with his initials, but with her mother's handwriting traced from a letter Ellie had once shown him, that read, "Love is not what finds you. Love is what you return to." And when he asked, "Will you return to this with me?" Ellie didn't answer with words. She simply nodded, eyes full of tears and laughter. And that night they danced barefoot in the grass. No music, just wind and memory and the hum of cicadas. And they were not characters in a romance novel. They were real, flawed, whole, and completely present. And in the weeks that followed, they married on the land her parents once called sacred, with neighbors seated on hay bales and children chasing chickens through the aisle. And Lily, a neighbor's daughter who had bonded with Ellie during the legal fight, walked ahead of her, dropping wildflower petals and laughing all the way. And their vows were not elaborate, they were simple. "I choose you not just now, but always." And after the ceremony, they didn't leave for a honeymoon. Instead, they turned the barn into a temporary classroom and the guest cabin into housing for veterans. Learning agricultural skills through a new nonprofit they launched called Second Soil. And every week, new faces arrived, people carrying their own broken pieces, people who had seen too much or lost too much and were looking for soil where something new could grow, and the ranch became more than a home. It became a place of healing. And this mirrors a growing real-world movement where trauma-informed farming programs across the country offer therapeutic agricultural work for veterans abuse survivors, and those recovering from addiction programs like Growing Veterans in Washington State or Warrior Farm in Pennsylvania, where soil becomes therapy and labor becomes healing. Ellie and Robert joined that mission not as saviors, but as stewards of the land and witnesses to its power to restore. And in that decision, they found not just love, but legacy. And here's where we step back and ask what this story really means. Not just as entertainment, but as an emotional map for what so many people crave. Because in a world that often moves too fast, that forgets too easily, that prioritizes profit over people, this story offers a different blueprint. It says that love doesn't always look like passion or perfection. Sometimes it looks like building a fence together, or making breakfast in silence, or sitting beside someone as they weep and say nothing, because you know nothing is required, only presence. And that's the lesson I want to leave you with. Not just that people can change, but that people can heal, and that healing often happens in the most unexpected places, in dusty barns, over dinner tables, on porches, under stars, and when we give others the space to return to themselves without pressure, without judgment, we become part of that healing too. So whether you are Ellie holding everything together by sheer will, or Robert running from the wreckage of a life that once made sense, or a neighbor who just needed someone to believe their story matters, remember this: love is not what saves us. Love is what sees us and keeps seeing us until we start to see ourselves again.